Great, welcome everybody. We have a really great turnout today for our talk on Golden Gate Park. Just to let everyone know that we will be taking questions at the end of the event. You can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the page. And I'm going to introduce Dorla Cantu. She is our committee chair for the speaker series.
There we go. Thank you, Louis. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Today's speaker, Christopher Pollock, was tapped in 2016 by the San Francisco Recreation and Park Department to be their first historian in residence for all of the city's parks. His initial project was to research and record the history of the department's some 225 holdings. With the 150th anniversary of Golden Gate Park in 2020, he launched the latest version of his book, first published in 2001, San Francisco's Golden Gate Park, 1,017 Acres of Stories. The publication by Norfolk Press is a hybrid of history and a tour guide of the park's many features. This was preceded by another publication, REEL, R-E-E-L, San Francisco Stories, an annotated filmography of the Bay Area published in 2013, which is about the some 650 movies filmed in the Bay Area since the beginning of talkies. Chris started his career as a designer specializing in interior architecture. With this experience, he changed gears to focus on historic preservation, specializing in historic research. A native of Connecticut, Chris has resided in San Francisco since 1979. The link for Chris's book can be found in the chat section and will be included with the link to the recording. Welcome, Christopher.
Hi, Dorla.
Hello.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm really glad to be here. And although I'm not in it right now, I'm portrayed in Golden Gate Park in Lindley Meadow in a wonderful time of year. Later on in April, you'll see the same kind of blossoms that are shown in the photo that I'm sitting in. So let me start the video here and we'll get started. So Golden Gate Park, it's one of my favorite places in San Francisco. And you can see in this photograph that it is really a huge park that's surrounded by the city of San Francisco on the San Francisco Peninsula. I got involved with the history of Golden Gate Park when I published my first book that Dorla mentioned a moment ago, San Francisco's Golden Gate Park, a hybrid history and tour guide. And that led me ultimately to, after even retirement from the design world, to become the historian in residence in 2016 for the Recreation and Park Department. And this is their internal magazine that was published the following year, showing, letting people know that I was now part of the department. So my time with Golden Gate Park has probably been about 25 years of history, and much of that was gearing up towards the 150th anniversary during this past year of Golden Gate Park. The park was initiated in 1870, and this past year were intended to be huge celebrations. However, life happened, and so it was a rather muted thing. But hopefully the observation wheel will be open again in the music concourse to help people feel more with a celebration. I want to point out a little bit of a connection between UCSF on Parnassus and Golden Gate Park. These are 3 postcards from my collection that show the initial buildings in the late 1900s that are the genesis of called then the affiliated colleges that are the genesis of UCSF as we know it today. And so you see in these postcards tennis being played over 100 years ago where the tennis courts are today, baseball being played in Big Rec, still there today, and on the lower right, the Arizona Garden right next to the Conservatory of Flowers with the affiliated colleges in the background, still there today. So let me give you some background of about how Golden Gate Park came to be. In 1865, and this is a clipping from the Daily Alta California, there was started discussions of having a great public park wanted in San Francisco. And now you got to understand that San Francisco was still very young. It was a town that didn't have much of a track record, but it probably, their interest in having a park had to do with the fact that New York had Central Park being built, and people knew that that was going to be a great recreation ground, certainly for the city of New York. And San Francisco saw itself as a great metropolitan city in the future. So they were starting to think about, well, how can we attain that? So after various discussions and tests and how a park should be created, ultimately in 1870, the state enacted and approved on April 4th, 1870, the initiation of the idea of Golden Gate Park. And this is a state-sponsored thing. It's not a city-sponsored thing because the city just didn't have the clout at the time in order to pull this off. So in fact, it's run by the state, overseen by the state between 1870 and 1900. Well, so the development of the park, here's what you basically had to deal with: mostly sand dunes with some amount of shrubbery. And how do you make this look like something that in the setting that I'm sitting in right now with greenery and trees behind it was a huge project. So the scale of the project was enormous. It was 1,013 acres within the city of San Francisco. And this map was created in 1870 in order to show how the park, yet unnamed in this map of 1869, would be laid out. And it was surrounded by all sorts of the entire western side of San Francisco, none of which had been developed at that point. All that street grid that you see on either side of the park did not yet exist. Only downtown existed. This was something that would come about in the future and obviously has over time. So who is the man who designed Golden Gate Park? A lot of people think John McLaren, maybe Frederick Law Olmsted, who was the co-designer of Central Park in New York. Well, they had hands in it, but the real designer was William Hammond Hall. He was born in Stockton, a California guy, and he went on to become a civil engineer, and he worked with various firms as well as the Army Corps of Engineers before launching out on his own. And it's he who was hired in 1870 in order to design Golden Gate Park and create something out of nothing. So the question is then, how do you do that? And this was really being done in the face of a lot of naysayers. Here's the Sonoma Democrat in 1873, a little bit after the park was actually started, but it gives the tone of some people. Of all the elephants in the city ever owned, they have now in the largest and heaviest in the shape of Golden Gate Park, a dreary waste of shifting sand hills where a blade of grass cannot be raised without 4 posts to support and keep it from blowing away. So that was the scene that people were seeing in all these sand dunes. And how is anybody going to create something? Well, believe it or not, William Hammond Hall really was quite far-sighted and was able to come up with a plan of the area. This is a very early plan showing how he would use the what Frederick Law Olmsted called the genius of the place. In other words, utilize the hills and valleys and such that are within this sand dune area and create these curving roads, no straight roads. Everything would have kind of a lazy daisy romantic kind of feeling about it. So how do you do that? And it's a process that was well known at the time, had been used in various other countries in Europe and such, a thing called plant succession. And the whole idea is that you start off from left to right here over time, growing very low plants, perennial grasses, going into shrubs, trees, and then larger trees. And that's how the park was built over time. Later on, some 20 years after William Hammond Hall had actually started the park, he ends up leaving and John McLaren comes into the picture overseeing the park for the next 50 years. And his name ultimately is much more famous, but it was William Hammond Hall who was actually the developer of the whole park concept and how it was going to be carried out, and McLaren followed in his footsteps. So within the park, there are many early structures that create, beyond the landscape itself, those things that we see today. And one of them is really the beloved Conservatory of Flowers. It was the first public building created within the park. And although it was not donated by James Lick, who, for example, Lick gave the monies for the Lick Conservatory, which is on Mount Hamilton in San Jose, and many other institutions in the Bay Area as well as California. Well, on his estate were some crated greenhouses that had never actually been assembled, and he died. And it was others who stepped in, a group of 28 men from San Francisco who bought up the crated structure and had it donated to Golden Gate Park for their very first building. And so here you see the Conservatory of Flowers in an unlandscaped area, and with its original dome. The dome you see today is actually a newer dome because this one burned in an 1880s fire. So here's a wonderful picture of the interiors showing the gigantic lily pads that would come to grow. These are from the Amazon area. And in fact, a small child can float on one of these lily pads. They're so large and so buoyant in the pond. And here's another stereoscopic slide of the interior showing how it was built out by the late 1900s. On the outside of the building, the what is known as Conservatory Valley was developed over time in various ways. It's quite different from what we see today. You have the conservatory and quite a bit of walkways. And then on the left, you see the very first bandstand in Golden Gate Park. The very first, later on, I'll talk later about how music developed, but this was a big deal on Sundays. People would come to Golden Gate Park to listen to the park band, and the park band still exists today as such. And so here's another development within the valley, showing the Victorian plantings and how it was developed over time. Now, remember, we're all sitting in sand dunes, and all this got developed amazingly quickly. This is probably about the turn of the century. This picture was taken. So here's the first bandstand at the end of Conservatory Valley that I mentioned earlier, which was this little tiny gingerbread kind of thing. But it became so popular on Sundays that the Valley, Conservatory Valley, just couldn't hold the amount of people that would be coming in. So there was a move to create a larger bandstand across the way to the south. And so here's what was developed. This was where today's tennis courts are sited today. And in fact, the landscaping that surrounds the tennis courts with its angled and bermed areas is the remnant of this bandstand area. And you can see the decorative plantings known as floral plaques in the angled lawn. And the seating was at least 3 times what you actually see in this photograph. It was a huge area. And so here's a bigger view from 1892 showing that area of the bandstand, and you have the Key Monument, and you have a bridge going from the Conservatory of Flowers, and the bridge was to separate the pedestrian traffic from the fast-moving carriages, which sometimes got out of hand because of horses getting out of hand. So Klaus Spreckels then comes into the picture and decides to donate money to have yet another larger bandstand built in the music concourse. And the music concourse had been the site of the 1894 Midwinter Fair, the California International Exhibition. And that area had been carved and graded into the form that we see today. So it was just primed, to start receiving buildings. And Spreckels Temple of Music, here under construction in 1899, it was built there. And here's the finished product, all built of stone and some terracotta. It still survives today. Out in front of the band shell opening was a series of 4 statues that are still owned by the DeYoung Museum, but they're in storage right now and don't come out of storage very often. But I found this really great photo of a woman who contacted me with this photo of her Uncle Henry, great uncle, I think it was, and one of the 4 statues that are copies of those in Versailles. So another major building that came about was the Sharon Children's Quarters, or Quarters for Children. And this was not built without controversy. Frederick Sharon was one of San Francisco's robber barons, and he thought nothing of pulling the rug on various people in order to get money. He was all about money. And after he died, he left a sum of money to the Golden Gate Park commissioners to do with what they wanted. And that was dangerous because it was, it ultimately, because one of the trustees of the group of executors decided that initially there should be a gateway to memorialize Sharon at the front of Golden Gate Park that was going to be this elaborate gateway that was based on a precedent in England. And the San Francisco WASP, in true fashion, created this parody. Before we had Saturday Night Live, we had things like the WASP. And here they're showing Sharon as the keystone, symbolic keystone at the top of this gate. And then all of the many peccadillos of his life, people that he had kowtowed to or kowtowed to him, or had short-sheeted, or all sorts of things, including a purported marriage to Althea Hill, which he denied. And so during the potential building of this gate, William Hammond Hall comes back in the picture in order to representing the Golden Gate Park and meeting with the trustees and saying, you know, maybe this gate thing isn't a very good idea. Can't we do something for the public, for children? And luckily, William Hammond Hall was able to sway everyone in order to change it. So the gate had actually started construction. It was what was started was ripped down. And in fact, what got constructed was the Sharon quarters for children. And this is a very early photograph, probably done in 1888 when the building was just opened. In the foreground is today's playground, which has not even been developed yet. It's still just an open plot of land. And here's another later photograph of the building showing its stone construction and then the carousel enclosure behind. And the interior was and exterior were this Romanesque, wonderful Romanesque revival design that has succumbed to fire and earthquake and still survives today, even through those catastrophes. So another construction, early construction in Golden Gate Park of a different kind is Alvord Lakelet, which is over on near the intersection of Haight and Stanion Streets. And here's a picture of it about 1900. It looks very much similar today in its layout, and beyond is the Alvord Bridge. And so this is an early development in order to put in what is essentially an artificial body of water to create some ambiance and such within at the main entry to the park from today's Haight. And interestingly enough, later on in 1915, this is a clip from the movie Wished on Mabel with Mabel Normand and Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle that shows the spray of water in Alvord Lake behind that was used as a backdrop for that movie. And then Alvord Bridge, which was in the background of the first photograph, again separated pedestrians from these fast-moving traffic above, and still does today, although it's cars instead of horses. And that bridge on the inside, maybe you can see a slight things hanging down there, icicles, stalactites hanging down from the ceiling as part of the design of that. This bridge is very well known only because it is the first bridge in the United States constructed of poured-in-place cast concrete. But it isn't just the cast concrete, it's the fact that it has twisted rebar. In other words, the steel that is placed, steel bars that are placed inside in order to reinforce the concrete, making it very strong. And it's the combination of the materials that really, this is an engineering landmark in the United States and around the world, in fact. And there are other attractions that were built. The very first aviary in Golden Gate Park, which is really kind of the genesis of today's San Francisco Zoo, because ultimately the zoo was developed within Golden Gate Park, but not as a zoo, but rather as a whole series of isolated attractions that had bears, kangaroos, the buffalo that we still see today, and many other attractions. But this is the very first aviary, which successive ones were built in much larger scale as time went on. And of course, there are the natural attractions of Golden Gate Park, a postcard showing from about 1910 that shows what could be areas at the eastern end of the park today look very similar. The oak woodlands are still there today and are being manicured and make sure that we save those oak woodlands, which are indigenous to that area. Well, one of the big impacts on Golden Gate Park ultimately was the Midwinter Fair. And I mentioned earlier that the Spreckles Temple of Music was built into this basin that was created for the Midwinter Fair. And that sits today where this largest building that you see in this photograph. We are looking at, again, where the Spreckles Temple of Music would be. And then in the distance is Strawberry Hill that surrounds Stowe Lake. Well, the Midwinter Fair was constructed in 1894. Michael DeYoung was behind it, who was the creator of the Chronicle and later the donor of the DeYoung Museum that still exists today. And this was a big spectacle in San Francisco and done on purpose in order to create jobs, bring people to the area because they were having what was known at the time a panic, what we call a recession today in 1894. And it did just that. Many people came to San Francisco to come to the fair. So my book that has just come out in the past year is 1,017 Acres of Stories, is really a compilation of all of the many attractions, some 164 attractions within Golden Gate Park. And it tells the history of each of those sites in a walking tour that starts from the Panhandle and goes all the way to the west to the ocean. And the beginning of the book shows you a map with a list of all of the attractions that you could see and where they're actually located. And it goes into 6 chapters going from, again, the east to the west, using many photographs that are both historical as well as new. This photo on the left shows the Sharon Quarters for Children that I mentioned earlier. The Key Monument in the middle distance, which is now cited in the Music Concourse and which was a victim of June 19th last year with removal of the main statue. And then in the distance, the Conservatory of Flowers. So you can see that this eastern end of the park was just a big recreation area for those before radio, TV, and all those entertainments that we have today. And going through the book, you'll see examples of photos of the Huntington Falls, which is a completely artificial cascade. All of that so-called rock that you see in this photo is actually concrete that has been sculpted, and even the stepping stones that you walk over the bottom of the waterfall are artificial as well. And on the right, the wonderful Golden Gate Pavilion that was a gift by a sister city to the city of San Francisco. Other attractions are the Anglers Lodge in the park, and which has the angling pools. This is all a wonderful WPA, Works Progress Administration project from the 1930s during the Depression of the 1930s. And then on the right, a postcard showing boats being sailed over 100 years ago in the Model Yacht Basin, which still takes place today and is overseen by the Model Yacht Club. The aviary that I spoke of, the postcard on the left shows a picture of the gigantic aviary that followed the one that was built earlier. And in this case, the thing was so big that you actually walked through a tunnel through the middle of the aviary, surrounded by the specimens above and on the side and even below you. So it was just an enormous construction that was located up in the rhododendron dell. And the postcard on the upper right shows some of the many animals that were within Golden Gate Park, including peacocks. And there was even an eagle at one point. So there's within the book, there's also a separate fold-out map that you can pull out that replicates essentially the beginning of the book that shows the table of contents and will guide you through the park. So that's my talk to give you a little inkling about the beginning of Golden Gate Park and some of its very early history. There's a lot more that I could talk about, but if you look into the book, you will see it. And so thank you so much for hosting me here, and I hope to see you in Golden Gate Park.
Thank you, Christopher. We will take questions now. The first question is that they noticed that we will be recorded. I'm sorry. This has been recorded, and we will be posting this on our resource page probably within the next few weeks. So we'll be providing the link as soon as we get that. And then another question is, how did they construct over the sand dunes? Was the sand displaced?
No, so the sand is still underneath all of this. You only have to dig down a few inches and you'll run into sand. So that whole idea of plant succession was the fact that what they started out were grasses. So now you don't have a lot of water to deal with in order to water all this stuff. So indigenous grasses were used in order to develop kind of a mat, if you will, of interlacing roots. And so the whole idea of plant succession is the fact that you start out with that mat, and on top of which then you start putting in horse manure, for example, in order to fertilize. And you're letting essentially the grasses die off and become the soil that builds up over time. So there's quite a development of soil. And then in certain areas, they were also bringing in topsoil from areas around the city as well. So it's this development through plant succession, plants dying off and then being able to grow much bigger ones and getting them started in the sand.
Could you talk a bit about the park after the 1906 earthquake?
Yes. So the park figured big in the 1906 earthquake. It was the home to 3 different camps. The city was set up by Major Funston, and who was the Army, and he had military rule over the city of San Francisco and set up various camps around the city. Golden Gate Park, because of its open acreage, was one of them that had, as I said, three camps. So in the eastern end were a series of huge tents for medical operations and things like that. Ironically, in just before the earthquake, an operating room had been built within Golden Gate Park that known as the emergency hospital, a small hospital. The building's still there today, but that was wrecked in the 06 earthquake. So medical facilities had to be set up nearby by the Army. And so not only were there medical, but food depots and the tennis courts, and then living quarters. In the beginning, people were just scattered all over the park, living in whatever tents and rugs thrown over clotheslines that they could, kind of thing. But as time went along, in fact, barracks were built in parts of Golden Gate Park in big rows and big rec that is overlooked by UCSF campus. Was in fact one of the sites where these cabins were built. So there were thousands of people living in San Francisco for a couple of years, in fact. And part of the problem was by the time things were a few years later, by the time things were getting back, people were getting back on their feet, it was hard for some people to leave the park. And so John McLaren had to have them ousted from the park at one point eventually, because who wouldn't want to live in Golden Gate Park? Right.
Right. Could you talk about the statue that was removed on, you mentioned earlier, on June 19?
Yes. So the Francis Scott Key statue was removed on June 19th because he is cited as, curiously enough, someone who was a slaveholder, but who at the same time spoke out against slavery. It's a very confusing situation, and I'm not sure what to make of it without digging deeply into it. But that was the genesis of why that happened. And any of the statues that were toppled surrounded the whole idea of enslavement of people. And he was one of the people cited for that.
Do you know how far the sand dunes extended towards downtown?
Well, the entire peninsula originally was all sand dunes, all of it, everything. There was not much of a, little oak woodlands and things like that. But essentially the entire peninsula is sand dunes.
Oh, wow. And then do you know how does the Golden Gate Park compare to size to Central Park?
A lot of people ask that question. It's larger.
Yeah. Oh, it is.
It's larger by about 400 acres.
Oh, wow. I did not know.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Can you please discuss the buffalo who were present in the park and what happened to them?
Yeah. So a bison, as we call them today, more accurately, were brought into the park in the 1890s because there was a realization, even at that time, that they were disappearing from the plains of America. And so that's a very early on environmental effort that people are beginning to realize something like that, something we think of doing today. But so one of the things to do is, to put them in a safe place, and Golden Gate Park became one of those areas in 1892 in order to house some buffalo, as they called them at the time. And so that has not changed over time. The first meadow where they were penned in was near just east of the Academy of Sciences. There's an open meadow today that's still there, and that was the first buffalo paddock, as they called it. And then another one was developed out in the western end of the park in 1899 called Zeal Meadows, what we call the bison pasture today, that's still there. And this has continued over time. And as the herd thins out, it's has been amplified, but many bison have been born within the park. Even in the early days, it turned out to be a very good area for raising the creatures. So in fact, they have sold off, at least in the earlier days, bison to other cities around the nation.
Oh, interesting. How did the ship get placed at the end of the park?
So the Yoa, as some people pronounce it, the ship, Roald Amundsen was a famous sailor who plied the Northwest Passage. And so in the early 1900s, I think 1909, he sailed his boat that had started out in Norway into San Francisco Bay and decided to give it to the city of San Francisco. And so ultimately it was pulled up on the beach next to today's beach chalet. It was just north of the chalet, where there's in fact a monument noting where its location. But the monument was actually to the man who sailed it in, Roald Amundsen, who was the explorer who went through the Northwest Passage.
Oh, I didn't even know there was a ship there, so that's interesting.
Yeah, it's long gone at this point. However, it's not gone away. San Francisco, unfortunately, didn't take very good care of it, and it's because it was exposed to the elements, it was falling apart. Norway literally decided that we want it back, and in 1972, they were given full reign to take it back, and they did, and it's the feature of the Fram Museum, Maritime Museum in Oslo, Norway today.
Oh, interesting. Talk about the county building, which contains the botanical library. Is it restricted to horticulture matters?
No. Outside of COVID being restrictive, the building complex within the botanical gardens is wide open. Within that building, there is the library and exhibition halls, and then the offices for the Botanical Society and all the administrative work that goes on for the Stribing, or excuse me, formerly known as Stribing, the Botanical Garden today.
And when was that started, the Botanical Garden?
So John McLaren had an idea around early 1900s to create some sort of botanical garden, but it wasn't until Christine Stribing gave monies in the 1930s in order to fund what would initially become a WPA project to create the botanical gardens that we know today. And much of the bones, if you will, of the garden was laid out at that time, although there were no structures built, although there was planned one initially, but it was never built. And it wasn't later on until the 1960s. But Christine Stribing was the one who gave monies in order to start the creation of our botanical garden.
Great. Any comments on the current Ferris wheel?
I'd love to ride it at some point. Personally, it's not going to be there for that much longer. So it's something I think probably has great views from the top. And if you've ever been on the London Eye in London, it's kind of a similar experience probably.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that there is currently some kind of art installation kind of in that area as well. Is that still there? Lights of some sort.
Oh, well, yeah, there's a lighting installation that's really threaded out from east to west, starting at McLaren Lodge. Peacock Meadow has a series of illuminated artistic trees that are all LEDs that are really wonderful. This is all going to be taken down by April 4th. And then continuing on to the west, the Conservatory of Flowers has the illuminations still going on the building at night. And then in the music concourse itself, there is special lighting, has been special lighting of the Spreckles Temple of Music. And the wheel has been lit up, even though it's not running as well.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure this could draw out to be another presentation, but just maybe touch on a few. But what movies have been filmed in the park?
Yeah, that's a big subject for me, because not only am I movie centric, I made sure that I could identify all the movies in the park. There's just so many. Heart and Souls, which was done in the 1990s, is one of my favorites. using part of the Conservatory of Flowers that some real movie magic happens with that one, where a bus suddenly is inside of the Conservatory of Flowers. And on other presentations, I've actually done a movie clip showing that. And well, movies have been filmed from the very beginning and still continue to be. There was a film, Geisha, I'm going blank on the name of it, but it was essentially a Geisha Japan movie filmed in the Japanese tea garden in the 90s. You would never know you were in Golden Gate Park because it all looks totally authentic. Most of it is actually set, I believe, in Tokyo. And yet they came here because they were able to use the authenticity of the garden in some of the settings within it. Scaramouche, filmed in the 1950s, is another film that you have to look closely. The movie is set in France, and you are on galloping horses going by Stowe Lake, and then galloping across Spreckles Temple of Music at one point. And then the rustic bridge at Stowe Lake, and that's another one that, again, if you didn't know, you probably wouldn't think too much about it. But so many parts of the park have been portrayed, sometimes just for their, believe it or not, for the woodlands. A very early film in the 1920s starring Mary Pickford, of all people, a very early movie star who created her own studio, came here to film the woods of Golden Gate Park. Why she would come from Hollywood up here, I still don't get. They certainly have woods of some sort in Southern California.
Right.
I think she liked the area because she had spent other time here, but she did a lot of scenes of Dorothy Vernon and Haddon Hall, which is available on DVD, and scenes were filmed within Golden Gate Park. Although it's just trees and meadows, it's not the kind of sites that you might want to see, something recognizable.
Right. Yeah, interesting. The Japanese tea garden, when was that established? And what is the history? How did that come about?
Yeah, well, that was part of the Midwinter Fair. Midwinter Fair left us with several elements, and so that was created in 1894 as a Japanese themed exhibit kind of thing, and at least half the size it is today. And it ended up staying there and has evolved over time, but has stayed true to its roots of being a Japanese-inspired garden with buildings and plantings and all of that. So it's a very special place.
Are you able to take a walking tour provided in your book in one day? Or is it better to break it down into days?
Oh, no. Yeah, although I laid out the book as much as I could on the walking tour, I think you'd really have to limit it to, breaking it into pieces.
Yeah.
The eastern end is just, for every square 100 feet, there's something. Seemingly, I'm exaggerating, but as opposed to the western end, which is the wilder end of the park. So you have a real intense amount of things in the eastern end. And so, but I've laid it out as best as I could as a walking tour.
Are there any natural creeks in the park that provide water to the various lakes, or is it all man-made?
Well, interestingly enough, I've looked into this over time because I've heard various opinions about this subject. And part of it revolves around something that is unique to our climate. And that is, for example, I'm from the East Coast originally. And, when you've got a stream in the East Coast, it's there all year round. Well, that isn't true in California. You have streams that are there in the wintertime, but the stream bed is dry in the summertime. So, there were areas apparently in Golden Gate Park that would collect water in a basin area because the underlying earth could hold it. But the only true spring that I have actually come across in documentation is for the chain of lakes. That the chain of lakes was actually started because of a spring-fed area that was all year round, and water bubbling out of the ground as it was described in the newspaper article in the Chronicle. And that's the only one, so chain of lakes.
Huh, interesting. What effect did the hippies have on the park?
Well, they made it more famous ultimately. You know, some people, when it was all happening in the 70s and 80s, thought they're ruining our park. But you can't imagine the press that it gave Golden Gate Park really over time. So I think the way Rec and Park looks at it even today is that it really enhanced our image in the sense of creating a space for people to express themselves, the Panhandle specifically, and areas at the eastern end of the park, especially Hippie Hill, of course,
Right.
which is part of Sharon Meadow, all became very famous. And whenever people come to San Francisco, they want to visit that area. You know, you go to Haight Street, you go to Hippie Hill, kind of thing. So I think they've only left a legacy that is good.
Yeah. I have several questions actually about windmills. I mean, can you talk about the windmills and what was the water source for, well, you kind of covered on that, but actually how did the windmills come about?
So the windmills are really interesting because it's really the lifeblood. Water is the lifeblood of the park. And here you've got William Hammond Hall trying to grow a park. And where did he get his water from? Well, interestingly enough, there is something called the South Side Basin that underlies all of the peninsula area, much of it anyway. And this is water that is way down in the soil. And this basin is like a giant reservoir underneath the peninsula that goes under part of San Francisco. And William Hammond Hall was actually able to access that in the very beginning. There were wells sunk in the eastern end of the park, some of which still exist today, within the park in order to pump groundwater into the water system. And now all that seemed fine, you know, away from the ocean, but when you went near the ocean, isn't salt water going to get into it? Well, there's this curious land formation that, so we're on the edge of a tectonic plate, and apparently the crust of the earth is folded in such a way that there is this dam, if you will, underneath that essentially keeps a separation between the fresh water and the salt water of the Pacific. So, and very close to the ocean, you can still tap into this fresh water, and that's how the windmills came to be. That when you combine free water with, you know, taking wind power in order to create the Dutch windmill, that's the northern windmill, and then later the Murphy windmill in the early 1900s, both wind powered, you know, what could be better? The truth is the wind power wasn't enough to really sustain the water that was required. And the wells that sat underneath those windmills are still there today and pumping water into the system. However, the windmills have become decorative at this point. But that was their main reason for being there.
I just have a few more questions. One, this is with your architect background. Is the Berkeley architect Loyola Hall related to William Hammond Hall?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
It doesn't strike I know of many of his relatives, but that doesn't strike a bell with me.
This person said, I've noticed statues in Golden Gate Park honoring certain international heroes, such as the early Irish independence martyr and Puccini. Can you talk a little bit about those installations?
Yeah, the statues in Golden Gate Park are really a random collection of things all over the place. And this all have to do with, in the big picture, Victorians, which is when this whole thing started, were very big on memorializing not only themselves, but others, maybe within their nationality who had come to fame, in order to say, we've arrived. And so statues to either self or others was a big deal. And so you have a wide range of statues, many within the music concourse in Golden Gate Park. But this was all over the world. I mean, this wasn't any phenomenon that was happening here, especially, that's any different. So you have people who are of Irish descent who decide that, well, we've got this famous orator and we want to create a memorial to him. And maybe in some cases they've had a statue copied from, believe it or not, Central Park, and had the copy installed here in San Francisco. Or a famous musician such as Verdi. And we had Louisa Tetrazzini, who, and opera was a big thing in San Francisco in late Victorian times. And so Louisa Tetrazzini was a big star who was in San Francisco quite often. And it was she who unveiled the Verdi monument. So appropriately located in the music concourse. And so it's those and a wide variety of other people who were representing what had happened in the creation of California or various other situations.
Okay, I'm going to combine these two questions, but are there any current docent tours? And then is there any part unsafe for walk tour?
There are no, to my knowledge, docent tours of any kind right now, just due to COVID.
Oh, I see.
You know, the City Guides is the group that is putting together some of the tours. Other people have done it on occasion, but City Guides has ongoing tours, but they are currently on hold, to my knowledge, just due to congregations of people.
Yeah. And then unsafe areas, and then also were there dangerous people living in the outer sands in the old days?
Well, let me answer the dangerous issue first. Really, that you know, that yes, there are some homeless that are living in the park, but I really would not call it a dangerous place to be per se. There are certainly, we've had times where there have been upticks, but I wouldn't call the park dangerous at this point. It's pretty well patrolled and all. And in earlier times, certainly there have been people that have been found camping out. It was a really big thing in the very beginning of the park in order to make sure that there was nobody living there. Anybody who had originally owned land that became part of the park, and there's a whole patchwork of dozens and dozens of people who own the lands that make up Golden Gate Park today. They were paid money in order to surrender their property. And so the land became ward of the state, as I said earlier, up until 1900, and it was pretty well patrolled. But you've had various things that encampments that have happened outside of the park. There was a grouping of old trolleys that was just outside of the park near the beach many decades ago. But within the park, see, in the early days, the people who worked in the park lived in the park. So they kind of had an internal police force, if you will. And in fact, everyone who worked for the park was part of the posse, essentially. They literally had the legal right to arrest anyone if they were doing something that they, or being there that shouldn't be. So no one lives in the park anymore. That's all changed at this point. Yeah.
So last question, promise. Can you talk a little bit about the Shakespeare Garden?
Oh, the Shakespeare Garden. Yeah, that has developed and grown over time. It was developed in the 1920s. It was the idea of Alice Eastwood, who was a botanist at the Academy of Sciences. And but she didn't make up the concept. In fact, it was something that was being done in, it was the Bard's, I forget what, not bicentennial, but Shakespeare's big anniversary in the 20s, and people were doing this kind of thing all over the world. And so this was developed with the idea of growing in a small area plants that were mentioned in Shakespeare's works. And Senator Phelan was one of the major donors to begin that garden. The brick wall that you see today was the very beginning, which houses a bust of Shakespeare, a bronze bust. And the garden has been enhanced over time with gates, and is a really great venue for weddings. But it was renovated just a few years ago, and when I say renovated, it wasn't really so much changed as it was cleaned up, and the bust was exposed for everyone to see at all times now. So it's been returned to its original grandeur for being a very formal garden within the very wooded Golden Gate Park.
Okay, well, great. Dorla, did you want to say anything, or did you have any comments?
Well, I'd just like to thank you, Chris, for a very interesting talk, and hopefully we can have you back sometime, maybe to talk about the movies that you mentioned.
Sure. I'd love to. With movie clips even.
Oh, great. Okay, well, that would be fun. We're planning a couple of other sessions right now, and we'll be posting that information on the website. I just wanted to also say that if those of you who are listening today have suggestions for future topics, please let us know. We'd be happy to hear from you. Anyway, for now, thank you so much again.
Yes.
Thank you, Christopher.
Thank you, Christopher. That was great.
Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
I just ordered my book. Looking forward to receiving it, Christopher. So thank you so much. See you.
Good.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.